Very good. Let's jump in. I see a few people connected, and some will trickle in. Thank you for joining. So Gabriel Zazzaprin, principal for North America, based out of New York City. We'll tell more about the company in a few minutes. Experience across all the major sectors that Avencore cover. Good exposures to standardization, all various redesign projects, and again, we'll tell you a bit more in a bit.
Thanks, Gabriele. My name is Gautam Rajbhaskaran. I'm a manager here at the North American office as well. Nice to meet everyone. My background is really in automotive and aerospace and energy as the three main sectors that I play a part in. About a decade of professional experience, in which 9 of them in consulting, and I have some background in the automotive industry itself. My focus is really on design to cost and product performance. Done a lot of work on standardization as well as modularity, and we can talk more about that during the rest of the webinar as well. Thank you.
Very good. So before we jump into the topic of today, just a few words about Avencore. We are a management consulting company with offices in New York, Paris, Germany, and a satellite office in China. And we really focus on competitiveness of all kinds of industrial companies, from new startups to global international groups. 3 main pillars of offering: growth, performance, and transformation. So growth, of course, everything related to business plan, product strategy, and the portfolio. Performance touches more on the design, of course, supply chain, and this could be about products, but also processes, so all the CapEx, OpEx optimization topics. And transformation is really about changing the way company operates, including the layer change management that's always needed for that. And since 2 years, we've added a data science and AI offering. We don't have a piece of software off the shelf, but we develop and tailor algorithms and models to help our clients with their industrial challenges. Just a few key figures about our company, created in 2009. About 120, 130 consultants, all with an engineering background. That's important because we really speak the same language as your teams and as your suppliers, so really can get into the details of cost, technical challenges, and we'll talk about those today. And finally, well, you've seen it a bit in my background and the one of Gautam. Really are across all major industries or major sectors, which can benefit our clients also with some interesting comparisons and benchmarks. Again, quick intro, but let's jump into the topic of today.
Excellent. Thanks, Gabriele. So yeah, let's start with talking about standardization itself. And if we jump straight into the next slide, I think it's important to understand where industries stand and the challenges that they face. So yeah, so when we speak about industrial companies, regardless of which sector, we hear about the same challenges come up again and again. So first of them is most companies experience cost levels that are too high compared to their competitors, which could play a part in weakening their competitiveness in the market themselves. They may also struggle with negotiation with the suppliers, often due to lack of consolidated volumes, especially in industries where you make a lot of custom products to address different markets. In addition, time to market is another common concern. Development times limiting the ability to respond quickly to market changes is another common challenge. Product portfolios have also been growing increasingly complex. So over time, customers' requests, regional requirements, historical decisions all create a proliferation of variants, references, and configurations that become difficult to manage. In some cases, companies also struggle to capitalize on existing developments and reuse of technology building blocks. This is often due to a strong from-the-scratch engineering culture that resides in engineering-focused companies, where new projects are treated on a very custom, unique case-by-case basis, which results in duplicated work and avoidable costs from a development standpoint. This is really where standardization becomes a powerful lever, not as an objective by itself, but as a way to improve cost competitiveness, accelerate the development, and reduce complexity. Okay. Now, moving from the challenges, it's important to talk about standardization as not necessarily a universal solution. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes of an organization is either over-standardizing or under-standardizing. So the real challenge here is determining whether standardization creates value and whether differentiation remains critical to the business and the market that it serves. So a few dimensions that need to be balanced. I'll walk through a few of them. So market characteristics. So obviously some segments require strong differentiations while others are more suited to a more standardized approach. So it's really market-based. Technology maturity. I would say that emerging technologies are actually difficult to standardize just because you need that flexibility and you're doing it first of the kind. And therefore there are a lot of learnings that come about it. So when you compare to mature technologies where it's really about run rate and increasing the steady state production capabilities, that's where standardization could be easily implemented. Organizations must also consider the development processes and how configuration management is there and a balance between the customization as well as the configurability. So beyond engineering, there's a significant industrial implications. So standardizations can improve purchasing leverage, simplify the supplier base, reduce on-hand inventory, increase economies of scale, and improve maintainability and spare part management. Ultimately, standardization is not a product decision. It's a business decision that impacts end-to-end from engineering, operations, procurement, supply chain, down to the service.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. Now we want to dive a bit more into the benefits of standardization, but also, of course, some of the trade-offs, some potential drawbacks to be considered. And we'll talk about those that can be perceived by the final customer and also those that are more transparent, I would say, to the final end user. So regarding some of the benefits that are visible for the final client, of course, reduced time to market because you will have faster development cycles. So that can mean also, faster renewal of the product offering. It simplifies the streamlined product portfolio, which again can be beneficial because it makes your offering easier to understand. Typically, improve product reliability because it's about standardizing, so reusing some proven components and solutions. So overall, there should be less quality. And if we think about some businesses with pretty important heavy maintenance operations, that reuse of proven concepts should translate into improved repair times. Reusing the same routing, some of the tools also for some of your operational teams. Of course, there's always some trade-offs and drawbacks to be considered, and we wanted to highlight some of those. When you try to over-standardize, the products may become less suited to specific customer needs, especially in some market segments where there are some very highly diverse usage context. There could be a risk of over-specification, like you standardize to a certain level, and so there could be some products that could have benefited from lower specs or requirements, but now you're a bit stuck to that higher standard. Of course, if you have more standard products and components, if there's any defects that come up that could impact the robustness of your overall product, or if you think from a supply chain procurement point of view, if there's a shortage in some standard components, of course, a bigger portion of your offering may be impacted. It could also lead to some higher difficulty in designing, evolving the products, because you may end up being locked into some specific technological choices. So definitely a lot of benefits, but also some drawbacks and trade-offs that need to be considered. Again, these that I cover are more those that are visible from the client side. I will let Gautam talk about those that are more internal and not visible for the client.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. The ones that are not visible, that are probably more stays within the organization, within your cross-functional teams and how it impacts them. We can talk about those benefits here. Jessica, you can pull those up. So the first one is really from a development standpoint, really it simplifies the development in general by having those common blocks or reusable building blocks allows you to simplify the development time itself. Plus, if you pick those particular blocks in a very strategic manner, you can use them across different projects. And that allows you to have a kickstart into how quickly you can ramp up a particular project or development timeline itself. In terms of the industrialization side of things, obviously there's an economy of scale when you start reusing them across different projects, and that has some ramifications from a supply chain perspective, giving them leverage to improve cost basis as well. From an operations standpoint, if you pick an assembly that's very common across different projects, you improve the repeatability within the production site. So lessons learned could be transversely applied across different projects, and your costs become a little bit more predictable when you're using those reusable components. So from a serial production MRO standpoint, one of the biggest benefits is reducing the stock value. What we mean here is really the stock inventory that's there. Inventory on hand goes down as you have not as many variants that you carry for SKU standpoint. Also, resiliency to market change is a component. As the market changes, you kind of already have a position and you have a stance, and so that allows you to make a good mark there. Those are some benefits across the value chain. Now let's quickly take a look at some of the drawbacks that are there. I'll go through starting from the development side. Obviously, as you pick those particular standardization, you might have some upfront costs from an NRE standpoint or even material standpoint that you might have to invest in to be able to set those standardization components up. I think Gabriele mentioned it as well. Sometimes you might be locked in from a technology standpoint and you have some limitation from an inertia standpoint to be able to change your particular way of working or even design as well. CapEx, higher CapEx, obviously, and goes hand in hand with some of the upfront cost elements. And if you pick a supplier, you might be reliant on that particular supplier to be able to provide the same quality so that you're able to use it across those different products. And then the final point from an MRO standpoint, really obsolescence and kind of the management of that, you have some concentration there as well, is if that particular building block or standardization module goes obsolete, then you have a bigger problem from an obsolescence standpoint. All in all, these are some great pros and cons that can be leveraged for within the organization when it comes to standardization.
Very good. And of course, you didn't wait for Avencore to show up to start your standardization journey. Hopefully, you're already leading or have led some initiatives in the past. But how do we go about standardizing? So we wanted to highlight 4 high-level ways to guide your standardization initiative and journey. So talk definitely about components and parts rationalization is maybe the first one that comes to mind when people talk about standardizing. Subsystem platforming, so we're using some specific subsystems. Delayed differentiation and how you could manage that from a supply chain and industrial setup point of view, and also rationalization of your overall offer. So let's spend a few words on each of those. So as I started hinting, personalization, it's really about reducing a number of references used, parts, components, limiting their variance, which will have benefits on the procurement side, production and maintenance. Remember some of the benefits we already touched on. You can imagine in most industrial products, there's a lot of hardware, nuts, bolts, clips, washers, all that kind of stuff. And there's always some very interesting and juicy standardization initiatives that can be led on those with, again, volume benefits, reuse of standard tools and components of the production line. We've also mentioned some drawbacks. So excessive reduction may lead to product fit issues in some cases. So it's always better to think in terms of right sizing than just roll out too high standardization. If we go up a level from the components, and we can talk about subsystems platforming. So here it's really about designing different products based on shared modules, which allows a balance between the standardization and variety. Of course, it's not as easy as standardizing some nuts and bolts. You will need to clearly define the interfaces between the modules, and you can think about physical interfaces, think about cables across automotive vehicles, but also software interfaces, how those subsystems are managed and come together. And you really need to define an upfront, robust product architecture. I mentioned delayed or postponed differentiation. So here it's really something to be considered and to be pushed as much as possible across the entire value chain. The idea, of course, is that the products are standardized as much as possible upstream, and then they get more customized downstream, enabling flexibility while limiting the complexity. In this case, the key challenge is really defining the right cut or decoupling point, taking into account the supply chain and the industrial setup. And finally, at least for the conversation of today, I mentioned offer rationalization. So, of course, if you reduce the number of configurations offered to the customer, that can help simplify the portfolio and focus on the most relevant, higher value, higher volumes offering. In this case, it's really important to see the trade-offs between the market coverage and the simplification that you're pushing through those. So if we summarize these different levels, you can see that you can really consider these different approaches from the component all the way to the sub-assembly subsystems of for instance, think about a vehicle, up to the entire product. Then you expand to look at the product portfolio, and all the way to a plant, a manufacturing site, because as we said, there are some ripple benefits across the training of your team, the tools you have on hand, the inventory of parts, maintenance operations, and so a lot to be taken from this kind of activities. But now, how do we go about this? I'll let you go and tell you more.
Okay, perfect. So yes, so how do you actually build a standardization strategy? So the implementation of the strategy relies on a 5-step structured approach. It all first starts with understanding the market. So before even discussing standardization, you need to understand where differentiation truly matters. So often, not every customer requirement creates value, and not every feature deserves to be unique. So this means understanding the customer's segment, the competitive dynamics within that market, the regulatory requirements, and the market's expectation from a voice of customer standpoint. Afterwards, you go into the second phase, which is assessing the current position. So once the market is understood, companies need to have an honest internal assessment on their current situation. What does your market, what does your product, how is your product unique today? Where does the complexity exist within your development process and within your subsystems, and which particular capabilities already exist and which gaps remain, so that you're able to strategize what particular standard components that you would, systems, or even portfolios that you want to implement. Third is leveraging data. This is often where the biggest opportunity is uncovered. So analyzing part usages, configuration frequency, sales volume, engineering effort, and purchasing data all together to identify what is the most common element that you can use across from a product standpoint, from a system standpoint, or even portfolio standpoint. So companies need to identify those recurring patterns and quantify that complexity to be able to define a strategy. Once an opportunity is quantified and understood, organizations can start determining where to standardize and where to remain flexible. So that's that boundary condition of being able to delineate, this is the part that's going to be core and common, versus this is where the market demands flexibility, and therefore we have to draw the boundary condition there. Also needs to focus on which levers generate the greatest value. The goal is really not to maximize standardization, but to find the optimal standardization to hit your value that your customers. require. And finally, from a deployment strategy perspective, the standardization must become a part of the way the company operates. It requires a clear roadmap, I would say a governance model, ownership, and performance indicators and KPIs, as well as a strong change management to be able to ensure that these benefits are sustained over a course of time. The message is that standardization is not a one-time exercise. It's a capability or a reflex that the organization must build and continuously manage going forward. Okay. Now, the next part of it is really the key convictions of standardization itself. So across industries, we've observed that successful standardization programs consistently share these common characteristics. So data being very central to how you leverage it. Often this is underutilized and yet remains the most critical element to understanding usage and diversity and identifying those standardization levers themselves. Second is related to capturing the true cost of diversity. So often you need to look at the picture from a direct, indirect cost, but from a holistic standpoint. So in many cases, unit cost might go up, but if you look at it from a total cost perspective, it's lower. So it's very important to look at it from a end-to-end value chain and a business case perspective. Organizational evolution is definitely required. I just touched upon it on the previous slide, how new roles as project managers and configuration managers need to be able to be transversal across those projects to ensure standardization is being enforced within the organization. This requires some element of transformation. So you need a clear vision and you need to start deploying changes in behavior and decision-making and ways of workings to be able to implement it. And finally, we always say that it's important to talk to your customers as well. They should be involved in this process, as some industries and some customers don't really need, there's no value in standardizing with them, and preserving differentiation might make more sense to them. So really, that first element from a strategy perspective, really knowing your market is a key component, and having that dialogue with your customers is extremely valuable when setting up a successful standardization practice. In total, as a final note, I just want to leave one final comment. Standardization is not about just reducing choice. It's really about reducing unnecessary complexity within your development process while preserving what truly creates value for your customers. Okay. With that being said, that ends the presentation part. We'll now go into the Q&A section.
Perfect. And looking at the chat, looks like we have a handful of items. If we take it from the top, we have question number 1. What data should I look at to determine whether I should standardize? And there's a couple follow-on parts. We have how should I use the data? And then any recommended tools they should be using.
Yeah, really standardization, the objective is really mapping the diversity in order to manage and reduce the complexity going forward. So you can use a number of different databases. I mean, not necessarily databases, but you need to structure your internal product, components, systems to be able to look at it transversely across your entire portfolio of products. So I would say that's one of the main data sets that you need to do to define what particular things to standardize. I would say there's a host of technologies now with CAD, AutoCAD, that are able to assess the 3D configuration and the geometry of those particular components or subassemblies, and basically do a volumetric comparison of those particular components to have likely percent match from a volume perspective, allows you to find those standardization across your portfolio. So those are some of the data sets. How do you use them? Well, as I just mentioned, you compare them from a volume standpoint. You could look at it from a purchasing standpoint. How often do you purchase from this particular supplier? The frequency of that, all of those things can go into determining whether to standardize that particular element or not. At Avencore ourselves, we have a data science team, something Gabriela touched upon a little bit earlier, where we really focus to identify and work collaboratively with you to identify particular custom tools that allow us to compare those 3D models of all the different parts. For example, in the luxury performance bottles industry, look at those different variants of performance bottles themselves and see how much commonality is there. So is there a chance to commonalize the packaging that goes around those 3 different variants themselves?
Perfect. Then we have another question. At the beginning of the call, you mentioned how difficult it is to get teams on board, as they often want to develop everything from scratch. How can this be managed?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I can cover that one. I've gone through some of those myself with various clients. It's not by chance that we've been talking about the standardization journey. We don't want to make it overcomplicated, but it cannot be just a one-off exercise, the engineers or on the side trying to reuse some parts. It really needs to be led. Of course, if you want to have sustainable and important benefits, it really needs to be led almost as a company-wide activity. So we've been talking a lot about design, choices of components, modules, but a supply chain needs to support that. The logistics of it, including if you yourself assemble those systems, there will be probably requirements. Even when you think as those parts and systems go through your assembly line, on which side you are approaching, for instance, a vehicle, you may need to start mapping some guidelines, some standardization modularity guidelines, so that that can inform some of the design choices. You will need to interact with your suppliers so that maybe they deliver modules sequenced in a certain way. So again, you will need a sponsor at the right level with good understanding and conviction of this activity. You will need some new processes and governances to make the correct decisions, and some potentially new tools. Doesn't need to be super complicated, but it's of course important to document and share.
Great. And that will bring us to our third question of the call. You mentioned platforming. Can you talk through or point us to a real-life example of how platforms can address different markets?
Great question, Jessica. We actually prepared a couple slides that talk a little bit about that, so I'll jump to them really quickly. All right. So here, I'd like to first just spend a little bit of time talking about what platforming and how it can address, at the end of the day, the customer segments that I was alluding to before. And really, the principle of product platforming uses a lot of elements of standardization within it and expands it to how you address the customer segments itself. So how you determine these product platforms is really focusing on your core competitive assets. So those core competitive assets really come from your understanding of your position within the market and your core competencies as a company, as an OEM or supplier going forward. So that could be your components, that could be a particular manufacturing technology, maybe you have a proprietary architecture compared to your competitors. So you need to understand what your core competitive asset is, build your product platform surrounding that particular core competency, allowing you to then deploy those platforms to different end products in different combinations with interface points that are preset due to the standardization, and those can then serve different customer segments. So yes, this is very theoretical, so we put together a quick example of how this is done, not necessarily from an Avencore direct perspective, but I wanted to keep a non-confidential example here. So if you understand the F-35 program, it's a joint program within the United States and Europe. It's well within the Europe organizations as well. And therefore, there was a number of different customer segments. So the US Air Force, the US Navy, the Marine Corps, as well as the United Kingdom, Royals, Navy, and Air Force. So those are, I would say, the 4 different customer segments that are there. And so the way this particular product architecture was built was as a base version that they kept as a leverageable asset that's common across all of those different variants. And really, specifically, whatever the customer's value creation that they needed different versus the leverageable base was then expanded upon to create those different variant platforms. So in this case, really the base version that had most of the components were standardized across those different variants, and really to serve those unique markets. For example, for the US, the Marine really required the vertical landing capability because they're very short runways from a Marine standpoint. Therefore, that was a capability that was added on top of the standardization to be able to serve that particular market. The Air Force had larger wings and more tail control because they were more in dogfighting capabilities and required more performance from that standpoint. So that's a concrete example of how you select leverageable bases that then it can be expanded to address different customer markets.
Perfect. Then the last question that I have on my side here is, in your projects, have there been cases where standardization ultimately brought little or no value?
Yeah, unfortunately, as much as we've been talking for the last 30 minutes about the beauty and benefits of standardization, it doesn't always work to the extent that one would like. I have in mind, for instance, a client in the space industry, and there were some ambitions to standardize the product and the offering, but the fact is that the needs of the customers can be very specific. So in the specific case, there was still standardization opportunity at some components, a couple of systems level, but the initial ambition had to be scaled back. So if you have to retain something from this webinar, it's really that definitely it's a great tool, if we can call it like that. It needs to be deployed in the right way, and of course, Avencore can help a lot on that. But I think there's benefits across the entire stages of the value chain of the product or the offering. You just need to be positioned and led appropriately.
Great. And with that, I believe we are wrapped up with our Q&A portion of today's webinar. So just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you soon on one of our future webinars.